Pleasure to be hosting this together with you in the Dialogue Society, and I want to welcome Professor Voas as our star guest. He's going to be talking about Muslims in a strange land, and I couldn't say no when I was asked to chair, because I do feel like Britain is my homeland, not a strange land, so I want to see how this reveals itself in what you're saying. And I just want to highlight for me the gender issues, because when we're talking about, as you will be talking about, generational reproduction, really, it is very much a gendered issue. And I know that the Muslim community is a very fast-growing one, and there's been hysteria in the press that the most popular name in Britain is Mohammed. So we're talking about, I suppose, very topical issues. But Professor Voas is Professor and Head of Department in Social Science at the University College London, UCL. I'm also a colleague, I understand, but we never see each other. This is the nature of the beast. And he held many senior appointments in Essex, where I was also involved with very large longitudinal studies. We again did not meet. And his research involves change in modern societies and intergenerational transmission of religion and values. And if you haven't seen the TEDx talk that he's done, it's brilliant. I watched it this morning, which was my first introduction to you. So welcome, Professor Voas.
Thank you, Heidi. Well, clearly, since we haven't come across each other before, one of us is an imposter, and I suspect that it's me. But it's very kind of you to invite me here. It's slightly odd to be speaking on what's essentially integration, social cohesion, and as the freebie to be given the violent extremism booklet. But I do look forward to reading that. I also feel as though I'm in a thriller of sorts with the interrogation lamp on me. But anyway, I hope that I'm well illuminated. So it's not inappropriate, though, given that it's, of course, political concerns over extremism as well as immigration and social cohesion that have put Muslims in the spotlight in all Western countries. Academics who are doing research on migration have been considering the role of religion in acculturation across the generations, and that's a topic that's gained in importance through the rapid growth in religious diversity produced by immigration to the West since World War II. These changes have been important not only for migration scholars, but also for people studying religion who are interested in the prospects for decline or resurgence of religious commitment as minorities adapt to Western societies. So I'm going to be focusing on Muslim minorities of immigrant origin in the West. I'll focus on patterns of religious adaptation using the theories and evidence that are drawn from studies on migration and religion. The key questions, as you would have seen from the abstract that was circulated, is what happens to religious identity, belief and practice of Muslims who settle in Western countries. Initially, of course, the first generation might see themselves as strangers in a strange land, but as Heidi very aptly said, by the second generation, these are people who are living in their own land, and so one question is how much difference that makes. Do they gradually become more secular, or do they react against the dominant ethos and perceived prejudice by becoming more religious? Now, just to emphasize, I'm going to be looking at religious change among Muslims who arrived in the post-war period and their descendants. I'm not looking here at the situation of native Muslim minorities in Europe and North America. In other words, not, for example, African-American Muslims or Muslims in the Balkans or Greece or indeed European Turkey. So Just sort of give an idea of the structure of my talk. I'm going to work through the process in a sense chronologically, from migration to and settlement in the West, through to the transmission of Islam to the children of immigrants, looking at family formation, religious transmission within families, structural integration, and then finally prejudice and discrimination. I should say, I'm afraid the speculative ingenuity of sociologists has outrun our research evidence, so our ability to evaluate some of the theories that I'll be mentioning is somewhat limited. I should also say that to give credit where credit is due, virtually everything I say is going to be derived from a paper I wrote a few years ago with Fenella Fleischman at the University of Utrecht. That paper is easy to find, but I'm very happy to send a copy to anyone who's interested. But as I go along, to the extent that I refer to myself, I'm really sharing credit with my co-author, Fenella. So, of course, most Muslims now in the West are here because of the large migrations from Asia and Africa that started in the second half of the 20th century. Not that there were, of course, Muslims before and for a very long time, but the bulk of the population derives from these recent migratory movements, in combination with relatively high fertility, and those lead to increases in the number of Muslims and their shares in national populations. So in Western Europe, we're now looking at something of the order of 25 million people. There's considerable variation between destination countries and the origins and dates of arrival and reasons for migrations of Muslims. I think all of you are probably familiar with differences between some of the post-colonial migrations to countries like Britain and France and the different places that people came from, as against, for example, the guest worker migration to German-speaking countries and to a lesser extent Sweden and Denmark, and then more recently migration to Southern Europe, particularly from North Africa. And finally, of course, we can't think about this topic without considering the very large refugee or asylum-seeking populations from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and so on, to practically all of these Western countries. Well, what are some of the things that might be relevant to considering the religiosity of Muslims in the West? As a starting point, of course, one would be where they came from, and not only the countries of origin, but the socioeconomic strata. Now, they were specifically recruited to work in unskilled or low-skilled jobs, and many arrived with few, if any, educational qualifications. That's the European story. In stark contrast to North America, the Muslim population tended to be middle class and highly educated. But the socioeconomic status, even of refugees, for example, varies considerably from those from Iran, often very highly educated, through to those from Somalia, typically much less so. Well, the story of religion in the West and the impact of modernization is one that's been of central concern to sociologists ever since the creation of the discipline. It's clear that for various reasons the move from farms to factories, from country to the city, from illiteracy to education, deference to democracy, all of these had profound consequences for religion. And although it's still the subject of vigorous debate, it's clear that religious involvement in most Western countries is far lower now than it was on almost any measure 50 to 100 years ago. The United States has been at least a partial exception, but even there the trends seem pretty clearly to be down rather than up. So levels of religious affiliation, practice and belief vary considerably in the West. Nevertheless, most Western nations are relatively secular. You often find nominal affiliation is fairly high, but there's a reasonably uniform distribution across the spectrum from atheism on the one hand to orthodoxy on the other. Participation in religious services tends to be low on average. But by contrast, nearly all Muslim immigrants come from societies that are comparatively religious and where Islam is the dominant religion. It's not always the case. There are exceptions, India, some African countries, but that's probably the situation for the majority. There's, of course, variation in the countries of origin, in institutional structures, levels of religiosity. They vary from explicitly Islamic regimes, for example, in Iran, through to avowedly secular ones, for example, Turkey. But nevertheless, most countries of origin for Muslims are characterized by strong and ostensibly universal levels of belief. Prayer is very frequent, regular attendance at mosque is usual, at least for men. So I should say that in what follows, I'm going to be distinguishing religiosity, to use a term that sociologists bandy about, meaning religious commitments like practice and belief, from religious identity, or religion for short. So identity would be as Methodist or Mormon or Muslim. Religiosity is something that is more chosen. Religion is arguably a bit like ethnicity. It's something that, for most people anyway, is transmitted to them. Religiosity is a matter of degree. Now, it's tempting to suppose that Muslims might follow the path that has been found in the West of successive generations being less orthodox in their belief and less frequent in their attendance than their parents and grandparents. So that's one possible route. It's possible, though, that some members of the second generation or subsequent ones may turn to strict religiosity. And part of what's interesting for researchers is to identify the conditions that promote change in one direction or another. Well, how religious people are is largely shaped by upbringing, and as I've mentioned, Muslims tend to come from countries where religious commitment is strong. Sorry, I'm leaning back. The microphone is being moved to me. The mountain coming to Muhammad or something. So the effects might be compounded if migrants themselves come from distinctively religious or unreligious backgrounds. Here the evidence is kind of mixed. On the one hand, because they did tend to come from poorer groups and relatively disadvantaged, one might expect them to have been from traditional, more religious backgrounds. On the other hand, because they're typically young, male, and unmarried, that might suggest that they would have lower involvement in religion. But that's something of an open question. The next stage is to consider the effect of migration itself as a process. It's clearly a major life event. The event has an impact that can be positive or negative on religious commitment. The experience of migration, the heartache and loneliness, potentially alienation, arguably creates a sort of psychological need for consolation, and that's something that religion can help fill. And it would be no surprise that the dislocation that's produced by moving to a new land would also even be seen in religious terms, and certainly seeking divine protection along the way would be a natural step. Other reasons for thinking that migration as an event could produce higher religiosity would be that immigrants are forced to reflect on what standards of behavior are right as they're thrown into this new, strange environment. One possible response is religious perfectionism. There's a term, immigrant puritanism, that's been coined for this possible reaction to the ethical or behavioral dislocation that people can feel when they arrive. But so that's one side. On the other side, it's clear that migration can disrupt religious practice. So there's a change in religious culture, immigrants may not have easy access to places of worship, for example. It can be hard to follow religious prescriptions in the new countries. At least initially, things might be different now, but I imagine that relatively few employers made it easy to pray in the middle of the working day. There are other obstacles. It can be difficult to think about religion if you're focused on mundane priorities, as many people will be if they came to work. Religious participation is, in many ways, a matter of routine, and when routines or habits are broken, things can change. And then there's a matter of norms. What was expected in the old country may even be frowned on in the new country. So immigrants become conscious that other choices are possible. To really test some of these ideas, we'd need data that unfortunately we just don't have. Now, there was a scholar named Charles Hirschman who suggested that religious institutions were helpful for new immigrants in providing refuge, respectability, and resources. So on the one hand, they offered natural meeting places for people. It was a sort of refuge from feelings of loss and separation. But they offered a chance to gain respectability within the community in a way that might otherwise have been lacking. And then finally, they offered a host of resources. So this could be advice in the new environment, help in obtaining jobs, housing, loans, whatever, schools, language classes, social services, etc. Now, that view of immigration may be a distinctively American one. Active participation in a religious community might enhance respectability in the American environment, but less so in a more secular place. And indeed, in Europe, Islam is often seen as a barrier to immigration rather than a facilitator of it. People feel uneasy with religious identities often. That said, mosques do provide many of the functions I've just described. Whether or not that's outweighed by prejudice against people who embrace an overtly Muslim identity is again an open question. You might have, instead of a sort of virtuous circle or a spiral of religious activity and public acceptance, something more like a vicious circle of prejudice and then maybe the reactive adoption of an oppositional identity. Well, this contrast between Europe and the US is an interesting one. Perhaps it shouldn't be exaggerated. American public opinion regarding Muslims is clearly not particularly positive, and it's not clear in the US that Islam is as fruitful as Christian churches were in the early 20th century in producing what we call bridging social capital. But conversely, in Europe, it may be that Muslim organizations are actually helpful in producing integration. Clearly, a lot of European governments are interested in entering into dialogue, appropriate term, with Muslim leaders to promote community cohesion. And it's possible indeed that organizations could provide a kind of vehicle for political activists in the way that churches did, for example, in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And that might promote religious participation. So again, there's an on the one hand, on the other hand, situation in terms of influences on religiosity. Well, what about the effect of ethnic concentration, which in a sense is a polite term for residential segregation? The concentration of people of the same ethnic or religious background in a neighborhood is found to be positively associated with religious participation amongst immigrants in general, but Muslims in particular. So that's partly explained by the fact that places of worship are more readily available in places where people share religion. There's a kind of chicken and egg problem here about the explanation. But it does seem to be the case that within group contacts are associated with higher religiosity. So there's sort of network effect that operates in reinforcing common norms, and those norms, of course, may differ between the ethnic minority on the one hand and the largely secularized majority on the other. Well, what about the effect of moving to the West? So, although immigrants have many reasons, the sort I've outlined, to be religiously active, being religious in a modern Western society isn't the same as being religious in a traditional community elsewhere. Any religious worldview is strengthened by having a monopoly, and that's the case in most Muslim countries. The call to prayer is a regular reminder of the creed. Everyday conversations are punctuated by inshallah, reinforcing a kind of theistic outlook. So people make sense of their lives through religion without even being aware of doing so. Now, the social environment in the West is different in, I think, at least three respects. First of all, the ambient religiosity is much lower, and so religious commitment requires more effort, like staying warm in a cold climate. And secondly, religious belief is seen as a choice, not a given. People are aware that others, including people they might be close to, are holding different views on life, the world beyond, and so on. And then finally, Islam has typically a much weaker institutional position in Western societies than in the countries of origin of most Muslims. So that's something that will have an impact on the likelihood of following it may push people in the classical sense of assimilation away from their previous customs and beliefs. But that would be a sort of traditional sociological view. But subsequent work in the field has offered all sorts of refinements and qualifications to that classical story of assimilation. There's no single target or trajectory, and assimilation may describe a direction of movement rather than an end result. The forces of acculturation are rarely strong enough to push people from one world religion like Islam to another like Christianity. But while affiliation may not be affected, there's evidence that the religiosity of migrants is influenced by the context. So, first of all, interestingly, the form of religiosity may be shaped by that of the majority. There's a good deal of work in the United States showing how there's a shift towards more congregational forms of organization and worship amongst immigrant groups. I mean, and in Europe, for example, there's evidence that ethnic Turks pray less or less frequently, but they attend religious meetings more than their former compatriots. So that there's a sort of adjustment to cultural norms. But religiosity can change in degree as well as mode of expression. We know that people coming from abroad, from less religious countries, sometimes become more so in the United States. Conversely, those going to more secular countries elsewhere, in Europe, for example, may lose religious commitment. So, again, there are differences according to context and experience. The place of Islam in Western institutions is an interesting one. It's certainly clear that constitutional arrangements provide very different opportunities for the accommodation of Islam in different places around, for example, the regulations about building mosques or ritual slaughter, cemeteries, religious attire, provision of religious education and chaplains, all of these vary tremendously across European countries. It's unclear, though, what the consequences of the degree of institutional accommodation is for levels of religious involvement or the ability to transmit religion to the next generation. That's another area where more exploration is needed. So what about the second generation? We're slowly sort of getting through the process, and we're now on to transmission. Arrival in the West typically involves a change from majority to minority status, and immigrants need to really invest explicitly in religious upbringing to pass on the faith to the children. Well, families are more important than any other source of influence on religion and religiosity. They make a difference for a number of reasons. Some of those are direct. Parents inculcate faith in their offspring. But you can have reproduction of values and behavior unconsciously to the extent that parents serve as models for their children. And moreover, parents are making choices, again, perhaps not deliberate, related to their residential status, socioeconomic status, and where they've chosen to live, that determine the religious environment within which children are raised. There are questions about endogamy or in marriage that are interesting and relevant. One might have thought that would wane with the passage of time. The evidence doesn't necessarily point in that direction. Family formation, that is, starting a family, increases the likelihood of being religiously involved, and so to the extent that Muslims in the West tend to be almost universally interested in entering into marriage and starting families, could be a factor. And then here we come, if only briefly, all too briefly, I'm sure, to the gender issue. Islam seems to be an exception to the widely observed gender gap in religious participation. So men are at least as active as women. Now, of course, to some extent, this just reflects different expectations about mosque attendance for men and women. But there's some evidence that men are more religious than Muslim women, even on measures of attitudes and belief. And the relatively high religious involvement of men may help to maintain levels of religious activity in families. So I think that is potentially a factor. There's a strand of work on the role of religion in identity, and the question is whether religion might replace ethnicity as the most important identity marker for second and higher generations. So this could occur because racial or ethnic or national identities are more difficult to claim in an authentic way by the second generation. And a number of studies have highlighted the attempt to define an Islam that's separate from the ethnic culture of the parental generation. A typical finding from these studies is that immigrant parents are somewhat surprised by their children's rejection of some of their own national traditions as non-Islamic, and those children's determination to return to a, quote, real Islam. Well, it's, again, by no means settled as to whether this is something that's found. Orthodoxy, or a kind of orthodoxy, is only one of the ways in which children of immigrants may approach their religious heritage. Others have been described as taking a sort of consumer approach to Islam, adopting just those doctrines and practices that seem congenial. And a strong Muslim identity may be combined with relatively low levels of religious practice or even some religious teachings. And then, of course, there are some who simply abandon faith altogether and identify themselves as non-religious. That's still relatively unusual, but I think perhaps less unusual than people often suppose. Well, this conjecture about religious identity gaining primacy is an interesting one, but it certainly needs more testing. One of the suggestions that I've made, again for testing, is that there's been relatively little intergenerational change, either up or down, in the average religiosity of Muslims from the first to the second generation. But the second and later generations are more dispersed than their parents across the scale from secular to devout. Okay, so then we come on to Western hostility and discrimination, and this has arguably led to the emergence of reactive religiosity. The second generation is better educated, consistently report higher levels of discrimination than the first. They're more sensitized to it. So there's sort of irony that effects of structural integration may be offset by a wish to uphold a Muslim identity in the face of prejudice and exclusion. What are the possible responses to public hostility? Well, one is that one could become more religious in response to negative external evaluations. Another is that you might be, this is the sort of opposite possibility, you might be motivated to scale back your religious identity, belief, and practice, or maybe it has no effect. But there are suggestions that reactive religiosity is found, for example, in the increasing adoption of the headscarf amongst Muslim girls in some places. And there is evidence from social psychology of this kind of reaction identification mechanism. So individuals buffer negative consequences for their self-esteem through these responses. All right, let me try to wrap up here. So the classical theories of assimilation would have produced the expectation that Muslims in the West will become less religious over time, particularly as the second generation replaces the first in the population and the third the second. Migration can change priorities. The sacred canopy that you had in the countries of origin disappears. There's little mainstream support for being religious, let alone Muslim, in the new receiving societies. So the taken for granted character of faith is called into question. But that gradual acculturation clearly isn't the whole story or even the main story. I think there are a number of factors that contribute to relatively high religiosity. The nature of social origins, the nature of the residential concentration in the destination countries, involvement in communities that offer support, endogamy, and so on. But all of those are really shared by immigrants generally. There's nothing distinctively Muslim about those sorts of experiences. I think if there is something that's distinctive about the Muslim experience, it would be found elsewhere. I think one place possibly is in immigrant Puritanism. It's the reaction to what seems a decadent society in the West and a reversion to values that are seen as more authentic or authentically Muslim. There's then, with the benefit of education and idealism, Western individualism, the search for a real Islam that's free from defects that are identified in the parental version. And then finally, there's the inescapable pressure of contemporary Western suspicion of Islam on Muslims. Muslims clearly encounter far greater hostility than members of any other religious group. In the past, going back to early 20th century, I think it's clear that Catholic and Jewish immigrants faced somewhat similar prejudice. So this isn't in a historical context by any means unique, but in present terms, it's certainly different. Well, a lot of what I've been saying is speculative, and as I said, it's in a sense been a series of, on the one hand, on the other hand, hypotheses. I will be interested to hear your take on some of these. I think in the foreseeable future, the forces that might produce reactive religiosity and religious perfectionism will persist. But that said, the evidence from earlier episodes of large-scale migration, the flows across the Atlantic, for example, from Europe to North America, or from Jews from Russia into Western Europe and the United States of 100 or so years ago, suggests that religious minorities do tend to lose their distinctiveness over successive generations. So although Muslims in the West, I think, will remain highly religious into the medium term, it does seem likely that secular, nominal, lapsed, or inactive will ultimately outnumber the committed. Sort of interestingly, I think both adherents and opponents of Islam see it as being exceptional, but sociologists are more difficult to persuade. So with that, I'll conclude, and I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.